Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to another session of the Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today, we focus on cashew markets and policies. The session is available in both French and English, and you can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom left side of the screen. You can also follow this session live on our official Facebook page and our YouTube channel. The Global Market Encounter is an interactive webinar, and so we encourage you to ask your questions either by raising your hand during the Q&A session, and you'll be invited to speak, or you can leave your comment or your question in the chat box. Before I hand over to Jim, this webinar is made possible by the kind support of our partners and sponsors. And so we appreciate the support of the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Also remember that the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place in Accra, Ghana in September. Get ready and be part of the biggest cashew event in Africa. Online registration has started, and so you can visit www.africancashewalliance.com to register now. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Isaac. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you too?
Yeah, well, I'm still here and we're
All
still
right,
going.
good. What do you have for us today?
Well, today we're going to talk about the market. We're going to focus mostly on production.
All right,
We're going to have a
good.
look at
Over
some
to
of
you.
policy and regulation trends. And we're going to look then briefly at consumption and kernels trade and try and figure out if we can get some clues to where demand might be going in this rather strange times. So hello everyone, you're very welcome to our 96th Global Market Session. And let's waste no time and start to have a look at production. So I'm going to start with West Africa. And you can see on the screen where, if you didn't know, where West Africa is. So I'm talking about the region from Nigeria all the way round up to Senegal. These are key cashew producing countries. Half the world's cashews grow in this part of West Africa. That's a big change from 15 years ago. And it's a change that's continuing. Probably 5 years from now, it will be 60% of the world's cashews because it is the second fastest growing region for production in the world after Cambodia. And Cambodia, although a long-time producer, is a relatively recent entrant in terms of being a major producer. Cambodia is the second largest producing country in the world. In West Africa, we have most of the rest of the top 10, including Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, and others. Problem in West Africa is, of course, just to remind ourselves, let's try and get some context for the discussion of this year's crop. We have some of the lowest yields per hectare on farms. We have some of the weakest infrastructure, but it still, so far at least, has managed to cope pretty well with the export of raw cashew nuts. And it is the most regulated sector in the world. Therefore, it seems to me a good idea when we look at production also to look at policy and regulation because it is having a huge impact and it will have an increasing impact as the years go on. So let's look at West Africa. We'd start off having a look country by country. So starting with Nigeria, one of the earlier harvesting areas, Nigeria produces about 5.5% of the world's cashews. These are 2025 figures, growing at 11%, so fast growth. This year, trade forecasts, it's a kind of a poll of polls because there's no official estimates in many of the countries that we'll talk about. But my poll of polls, if you like, talks about estimates between 280,000 and 300,000 tons. That's lower than last year, maybe by about 10%. African Cashew Alliance sources. So we collect a lot of information from our reporters, and those reports are published in the Africashew Split. That's a magazine for members of the African Cashew Alliance. So it's not bad. It does a good job of covering the different countries and a general international report too. Interesting reason to be part of the African Cashew Alliance. But our sources, and thank you to them all, our sources talk about maybe 150,000 tons sold from Nigeria so far. Difficult to know, but that's what they're saying. So let's use that as a guideline. Quality this year seems to be normal. In some cases, on the better side of normal. It does seem that over the years that the quality of the cashew nuts from Nigeria has improved. Several factors at play: higher prices, better varieties maturing in the last few years. And we know in certain parts of the country you will get much better cashews than you might have got a decade ago. And of course, the transit of products in from Benin across the border. We'll come to that. So normal to good quality, some very high farm gate prices, very difficult to work out where these high farm gate prices are coming from when you look at the export prices. So I think they're a little bit exaggerated. I think there's a little bit of early season, let's say, hangover. So the prices may start high early in the season and then they may moderate. We might be still hearing some of that early season chasing of the first available products. So I think those farm gate prices are exaggerated. You cannot have farm gate prices higher than export prices over a longer period. So not too bad in Nigeria. Certainly crop a little bit lower, but that would be a fine crop for Nigeria, higher than most years. Bear in mind, and I'll say this more than once today, let's bear in mind that 2025 was a bumper crop in West Africa and across the world. So when we make comparisons, we need to be careful. Let's move on to the world's largest producing country, Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast in English, produces 26% of the world's cashews and is also growing quickly, 9% growth. So if you're last year producing 1.549 million tons and you're growing at 9%, that's fast growth. That's adding a lot of production very quickly. This year, estimates, and again, difficult year to predict, but estimates so far, quantity still pretty good. This would be an excellent crop, 1.35 to 1.4 million. So what's that based on? So that's based on speaking to traders and processors, asking people what's their experience this year compared to last year, asking them how much they've received and how much they expect to receive. It could be lower, possibly higher, but I don't think so. Definitely a later harvest. So we've two factors at play in this. Firstly, the weather, and it's not been ideal. But secondly, we have a 1 month later start to the season, nor is that ideal. That's a regulatory issue. And the regulatory body, the CCRK, decided that the government or the authorities were not ready for the start of the season following the elections last year. So it was delayed. That has consequences. When I talk about the infrastructure, the deficit of infrastructure, starting the harvest later means consequences for quality. So you've got the two factors at play: a late harvest, poor weather, and a late start to the harvest from a regulatory point of view. Quality, unfortunately, is nowhere near as good as last year. It looks more like an average year. So you will hear definitely that quality is lower, but think 2023, 2024 rather than 2025. 2025 was a really top year for quality in Cote d'Ivoire, maybe the best year that I can remember. And it means that we're back this year to more average quality. Now, it may, in the end, transpire that it's lower than average. That remains to be seen. We're at the end of March, indeed, we're at the start of April now. So therefore, we are running a bit late. This harvest can run into June. big questions around that. We'll come to some of those in a little while. Current reports say that processors, and theoretically it was only processors, who could buy up to the 24th of March because of the window, which excluded everyone except processors buying. But people are saying about 500,000 tons bought, or around about a third of the crop, a little more than a third of the crop. But it's bought, and we know that this can be processed, but we also know that some of it may well be exported. And we know there have been some games going on in the supply chain in the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks. Second crop, as I've mentioned, delayed. Delayed doesn't mean disaster, just to be very clear about that. Delayed means delayed. But it can also mean more risk because it is a rainy season crop. As time goes on, more rain, more exposure, weaker infrastructure. So we need to watch it, but it doesn't mean by any means that we're looking at a small crop. We're looking at a fairly decent crop for volume on what we know so far. We do also know that some of the exporters were in the market during the processor's window. This is one of the consequences of having this kind of dual identity. You can be a processor and an exporter. And therefore, it becomes less clear who's buying what and when. And that's, I think, probably led to a kind of a mini speculative bubble at the farm gate where people are chasing product. Now, they might be chasing it for reasons of quality. They might be chasing it because they have contract commitments. They might be chasing it simply because they want to get their contracts executed in case the market falls later. And in our business, as you know, if you've ever been in the raw cashew nut trading business, it's quite difficult to enforce contracts if prices go down. So if you've got a well-priced contract, your first job is to get that executed ASAP. So in both countries, the two of the big producers in the region, in the world, not ideal situation, but nor is it by any means particularly negative situation. Let's look at the next couple of important countries on the list, and we'll go next to Ghana. Ghana produces about 2.5% of the world's crop in 2025. Look at that growth rate, 8%, still fast. So we have 11% in Nigeria, 9% in Cote d'Ivoire, and now 8% in Ghana. First flush was poor. Second crop has improved, no doubt about it. Probably not as good as might be expected in a normal year for quality. Pricing quite variable. Now it's varying on quality mainly, but the quality has been lower. So you're looking at outturns. I mean, there are some bad stories on outturn, that's for sure. But in general, it looks to me, from what I understand, that we're looking at outturns 44 to 47. You would hope, and you would normally see maybe a 47, 49, or 50. There is an inflow of product from Cote d'Ivoire that is not legal from the Ivorian point of view. There's no impediment to it in Ghana. And it seems to me that that inflow is probably, initially at least, of some old crop that was in Cote d'Ivoire. It will continue. It has happened every year. The authorities in Cote d'Ivoire are trying to stop it, but it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one to consistently stop over the longer period of the harvest. Probably official estimates of the crop, which were as high as 250,000 tons in Ghana, I think these are probably overstated. I'm not sure if it's wishful thinking or just lack of data, but probably the crop is sub 200,000 tons. We're definitely looking at a longer season, similar to elsewhere in the region, and that longer season may well see more product arrive, may well see the crop get a little bit bigger. Don't forget, in cashews, a lot of the consideration on the harvest is farmers' motivation to go and collect those nuts and to dry them. If they think it makes sense, they'll do it. If they think it doesn't, they may not. So when do people stop collecting nuts? And this remains to be seen, but we have noticed in the past that if the season goes on too long in West Africa, farmers are simply busy doing other things. We'll have a look at the other big producer in this region, Guinea-Bissau, world share just under 5% of world production, growing a little bit more slowly, growing at about 4%. We had a really good crop in Guinea-Bissau last year. This year's estimate, plus or minus 270,000 tons, is what I hear. Last year, I would have put the estimate at 300,000 tons, so that is down a little. If last year the exports through the port of Bissau, I believe were around about 220,000 tons, maybe a little more than that, but significant volume goes across the border into Senegal for export through, usually through the port of Dakar. So lower than last year, I think by something like 10%. Farmgate reference price, no change there, 410 CFA. That's about $720. That's workable, but bear in mind, A, there's huge costs bringing the product from the farm gate to the port for export, and B, there are significant export taxes to be paid too. So this is something that makes the farm gate, you might be forgiven for thinking how come export is so high when the farm gate is so low? Well, that's about tax and cost. If we look at the situation, the crop has started, but it's not really flowing yet. Crop in Guinea-Bissau comes a little bit later. Seems to me, on what we know now, a decent crop earlier, and I'm going back 6 weeks, people had mentioned some rains that hadn't done any good during the early stages, but it sounds, from what I understand, that most of the trees escaped any damage because they weren't flowering at that period. So Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, not as good as last year, but by comparison with any other year, volume-wise, pretty good. Ghana definitely doesn't compare well for quality. Now, that means primarily on outturn. That doesn't mean that there's any other problem with Ghanaian raw cashew nuts, and they should process as normal, provided they're properly dried. And that's more of a challenge this year than it would be in other years. So many countries in West Africa. Let's have a look at a few of them. So one country that's made significant headlines in recent years is Benin. It's made significant headlines because the government banned the export of raw cashew nuts and supported the building of a major processing operation in the country, which now would have a capacity, or would have brought the capacity of processing in Benin well over 100,000 tons, maybe 120,000 tons, perhaps even more than that, not being utilized to the full. So how the ban has worked is it's a bit of a mystery in the sense that the supply chain hasn't adapted. There isn't enough processing capacity to process the crop. It has to go somewhere. Otherwise, farmers will suffer huge loss of income, and therefore we see smugglers active in the country. So what we see at the moment, it is an important producer, about 3% of the world's cashew nuts, growing quickly, 7% CAGR. So we're now seeing, and just to remind you, we're seeing Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Benin, all growing quickly in production. Guinea-Bissau growing actually at about the same rate that world consumption is growing, around about 4%. Early forecasts in Benin were, again, particularly the official ones, were very optimistic. Trade sources now say maybe something a little bit more like the average crop, somewhere between 160 to 200,000 tons. I would say it's more toward the lower end of that range, and I would say that because I think the production figures have been overstated for some time. Quality is said to be lower, and I say said to be lower because I don't have personal evidence of that. I haven't spoken to anyone who's reported that to me, but I do hear that spoken about in the market. So not a bad crop. Big questions around how that export ban is working. Big questions about the impact of that on the supply chain for processing. And this is a story that's going to run and run. What about Togo, next door neighbor from Benin? Production, well, you can pick a number anywhere between 25,000 and 45,000 tons. This year, they're talking about a somewhat reduced crop. I think what happens is that there is a distortion on production because there is so much product flowing back and across the various borders. So product will come in from Benin, as I've mentioned, but it will also come in from the north, from Burkina Faso, and possibly even from Ghana. So this is about logistics, it's about port of exit, it's about export tax. Now, the export tax has been increased. So if you get a really difficult one here, and we're going to talk about policy later. So you get a situation where Benin doesn't allow the export of raw cashew nuts, but they're smuggled and they have been smuggled into Togo for export through the port of Lomé. Well, that was easy when you could export it as origin of Togo if you had low export tax from Togo. But if you have higher export tax, do you still want to do that? It probably still works in terms of calculation for export, but you might be more tempted as a trader to start to move your product through Nigeria where there is no export tax and where you now have much better performance of the ports. So this may change the flow of product. I'm not condoning smuggling, I'm just reporting the facts. Let's move on and have a look at Burkina Faso. Important producer, about just under 3% of world's production, growing very quickly in recent years. The actual growth rate calculates at about 17%, which is surprisingly high, but those are the numbers that we're getting. Generally speaking, there's more positive outlook from Burkina. Maybe they were less affected by the kind of weather that affected Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. People are talking about a similar crop to last year. That's about 170 to 180,000 tons. You will hear higher. I don't think you should believe it. I think that some of the estimates are a little bit overstated, but production is growing quickly. So therefore, we're going to see more and more production from Burkina in the coming years. Farm gate prices started really high. Farmers had high expectations after last year. The minimum farm gate price in Burkina was reduced. It was reduced to 385 CFA. Export is closed for now, but I understand that processors and farmers have had trouble getting together to do supply arrangements because of high price expectations on the side of the farms and lower reality in terms of the international market, including higher costs. So this is one that's getting worked out. Export is closed, or maybe it's even opening today, maybe it's out opening shortly. But the export from Burkina Faso is again similar to Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, closed for a number of weeks to allow processors to buy what they need. And that type of regulation seems to work fairly well. Moving on, we're going further west now. We're going to look at the Republic of Guinea. That early estimate, 150,000 tons, we mentioned that maybe 4 weeks ago, still seems to be on track. Much more optimistic outlook than elsewhere. Again, weather seems to have caused some quality variations. You might have seen a couple of years ago a much larger crop estimate, but we think that that was often due to a flow of product from Cote d'Ivoire, from western and northern Cote d'Ivoire into Republic of Guinea for export through the port of Conakry, which to some extent, logistically and actually export tax wise would have made sense. But we also have to remember on borders, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Benin, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, on these borders, there are communities which naturally have been there for many, many years, hundreds of years, maybe more. Um, and their logical flow is the logical flow of business and perhaps the logistics mean that the actual political borders don't make a lot of difference locally. So we see product flowing back and across. It doesn't necessarily always mean organized smuggling, sometimes described as informal trade, but there is organized smuggling too. So you'll see boats and bikes, but you'll also see trucks crossing on all of these borders. And finally, quick look at Senegal. Again, Senegal is a later crop. Somehow my arrow for Senegal is extended into Mali. But the crop there, we think about 60,000 tons. Again, cross-border trade, mainly from Guinea-Bissau. You will see more product flowing in. In just broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that there, particularly in this central part of the region, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, possibly Benin, there is lower quality this year. Prices are adjusting to reflect that. To some extent, the industry or the trade, particularly the export trade, gets squeezed between minimum farm gate prices from the regulators and lower quality from the farmers. So sometimes it's difficult to reconcile those issues. We'll see as time goes on, but it will seem to me as if it's going to be difficult to defend some of the minimum prices. So what about West Africa as a whole, as a region? What are we looking at? Well, let's remind ourselves 2025 was a record crop. 2026 looks, I think, a little bit more like 2023. So it's not as poor as 2024, nor as good as 2025. Our low estimates, and we do this high-low estimates based on a mix of individual conversations, primarily how much have you received so far compared to what you received last year. Then we look at the official estimates. Then we talk to processors and we try to put together the pieces of the puzzle to give us a low estimate and a high estimate. You can see that the high estimate, certainly lower than last year, but still a pretty decent crop, better than the previous record of 2023. Even the low estimate, and just to say we are still relatively early because this is a delayed crop. Even the low estimate still is not a bad crop. So on the pessimistic side, we would say the crop could be up to 14% lower than last year. These now, the level of accuracy of these numbers, think of them more as trends than as exact numbers. So between 14% down and 3% down compared to last year. But when you look at figures compared to 2024 or 2023, still looks like a reasonably good crop. Concern mainly on quality. So quality, not in terms of whether the product is usable or not, it generally is, but quality in terms of its value, because we're trying to work with the variations in quality, as we've seen in some places. Longer harvest, that seems for sure. Weather risk as a result. And there is also another aspect of that to be taken into account. And that was, as I mentioned a little earlier, that farmers, so we're talking about smallholders, we're talking about subsistence farmers, we're talking about some of the poorest people in the world, and we're talking about those people now having to make decisions on what they do day to day. So they will tend to work on their food crops and they will then perhaps neglect their cashews or the collection of their cashews to some extent, or the cashews may lie on the floor too long. So some difficult signals. It would be easy to misread the signals. It would be easy to misread a late crop as a poor crop. There is, of course, plenty of chatter, plenty of rumor and gossip, and plenty of people in the raw cashew nut trade who would be happy for processors to believe that there is a crop problem, when in fact the problem is quality, not quantity so far. And finally, regulation. The enforcement of regulations is always going to be difficult. So many new regulations, so little investment in enforcement means that we're looking at a situation where the actual regulation becomes one of the most significant factors in the volatility of the market price. That is something we would not have said 10 years ago. So looking at that, let's have a little look at some of the impact of regulation. So you can see the countries, you can see the arrows. So here we again have our regional map. A black arrow is a normal legal trade of perhaps a landlocked country like Burkina Faso finding its route to port for the export of raw cashew nuts through ports in Ghana, perhaps through ports in Togo, even through Conakry in the Republic of Guinea. But you also have illegal trade. Now, what's illegal? It's defined as illegal if it's illegal in the country of origin. So export by land from Cote d'Ivoire is illegal. Therefore, you have the red arrows. Export from Benin in any form is illegal, and you can see red arrows there. Similarly, in Guinea-Bissau, product crossing the border into Senegal illegally. But again, bear in mind that there's significant production in this area toward the Senegal border, and there might actually be legitimate logistical reasons, contrary to the regulation, why that product should flow to ports in neighboring countries. Similarly, in eastern Cote d'Ivoire, if there was no regulation, the product would flow through Ghanaian ports. It would be normal. It would be cheaper. It would be quicker. It would make more sense. But we have seen through greater regulation, we have seen a surge in smuggling. Why does it happen? It happens policy and export tax variations, and particularly the fact that there are huge differences in export tax rates between countries. Some have none, some have getting on for $200 a ton. Also, the borders. I mean, we're talking about primarily borders written in colonial times, mostly between 50 and 60 years ago. They didn't take much care in doing that. And the borders just don't fit the logistics. Add to that an infrastructure deficit, export of cashews, export of cocoa, exports of a whole range of products, import of foods. All of these things have increased over the years. Generally speaking, the infrastructure hasn't kept pace with them, especially when we look at cashews, because we're looking at huge increases in production, but we're not looking at big increases in interior warehousing and drying facilities, for example. Access to jute bags continues to be difficult. All of these factors are complicating factors in this. So the product needs to move more quickly. If it can't move through the formal legal channels, it'll find another way. That's the way markets work. We had a similar situation here in Europe. It's some years ago now. Differences in exchange rates and taxes, and exactly the same thing would happen. Thankfully, that's history here, but it still goes on in the cashew trade in West Africa and elsewhere. These factors between them can create volatility at farm gate level, at village level, in local markets, which doesn't necessarily reflect the volatility in the international market. So if you hear a farm gate price in Nigeria that makes no sense against the export market, well, that may mean that it's being influenced by factors other than the export market. Therefore, treat it with caution. Treat that information, treat that news with caution. So that's West Africa. I think we've gone through a stage from real concerns about the size of the crop, and there are still some concerns on that, to more or less focus less on the size of the crop and more on the quality of the crop. What does lower quality mean? Well, for a processor, it means a higher cost of doing business. It may mean that it certainly means the outturn will be less. It may well mean that they get more breakage, depending on how the product is presented, depending on how well it's dried, depending on the rainfall during the harvest period. It means a higher cost for export, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that volume won't be there. It's just a case of finding the market. One other factor, which I should add, and let's just go back one for that, there was some carry out from last year in certain countries in West Africa. And if you look at imports, which I obviously do, if you look at the imports to Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire, for example, early this year, we might have a look at them in a few minutes, you'll see that there were early imports. That's got to have been old crop. There's no other way because there was no new crop available at that time. Okay, so let's let's go halfway around the world and let's look at Cambodia. So we quick look at Cambodia because what we've seen is a still fairly optimistic forecast on the crop. Last year, estimates 1 million tons plus. Again, these are not exact figures, but they're not far off. I think Vietnam bought about 965,000 tons officially from Cambodia last year, import towards the end, that is. People are talking this year, definitely 1 million tons would be on in terms of the number of trees, the hectares, the average yield. There has been some impact of unseasonable rains early on. Can we see any impact of that? Well, February exports were strong. Looking at figures of import into Vietnam, 60,000 tons has come in during the month of February. That is well up on last year. So that would suggest that the crop is coming on. That doesn't mean that there isn't some impact of this early rainfall in some areas. There certainly is. Usually March is the biggest month for export, and we're going to get those numbers in the next couple of days. So we'll be able to see just where that is. I was talking to a good friend in Phnom Penh recently, and he was saying that he expects a pretty good crop. Not sure if it'll hit the million tons again, but it won't be far off it. But a much longer harvest. It'll go well into May. We will see probably exports, and people will develop some ability to hold product. And there are some, Cambodia also suffers from an infrastructure deficit, but there is a little bit more ability to hold product. And indeed, last year we saw exports, albeit at lower volumes, throughout the year. So longer harvest, little bit more ability to hold. We are seeing higher farm gate prices, but there are also new trees coming online. So these trees are maturing. They've been coming on over the last, most of the plantings would have been in the last decade, and then again, maybe 2024, 2023. So there are new trees coming online, and not in the volume that they came online back in 2020, but still there is an impetus in production. I think this year we're going to hover around the million tons. It could be a little less, it could even be a little bit more. But as time goes on, a million will become the norm, and we will see crops higher than that too, certainly by 2028, all going well with the weather. Vietnam is impacted by climate change like West Africa. So it will be interesting to see how that affects the crop in the coming years. This year, farm gate prices are really good. They started around about $1,300 a ton, but they're much higher than that now, maybe $300 higher than that. They will ease, of course, as product comes in, but that will encourage farmers to continue with their cashews, and probably it'll encourage them to plant more cashews. Cambodia, fastest growing production in the world. If you take a 10-year average, it's something like 17%. A little bit slower in recent years, obviously back to single digits, but still growing. And that's really interesting. And most of that product goes to its nearest neighbor and the biggest processing country, the biggest importing country in the world, Vietnam. So if we look at the situation in Vietnam, so let's first of all say Vietnamese production is not hugely significant in world terms, 325,000 tons, something like that this year. Production indicators very positive. Vietnam produces a nice quality cashew nut. But most of the nuts processed in Vietnam are imported. So early season, and this is a key impact of Cambodia, let's join the dots a little bit. If you've got a million tons in Cambodia, it means that the pressure on Vietnam to enter markets in West Africa is so much less. So you have the situation of Cambodian production, you have East African production, which is now virtually all been shipped. I think it all has been shipped, in fact. So you're looking at a situation where the need or the inclination of Vietnamese processors to enter the market in West Africa is much less than it would have been. So you're not going to see early season surges in buying in years where the crop in Cambodia and Vietnam is a normal crop and in years where processors have had the opportunity to buy product from East Africa earlier in the season. So imports, key factor, and imports January until the 15th of March, up by 21% on last year. And the bottom chart you can see there, 2025, January, February, first half March, every month higher, and a big, big gap emerging in the first 2 weeks of March. We would expect that to continue. Where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from Tanzania, it's coming from Cote d'Ivoire, it's coming from Nigeria. Generally speaking, imports so far, prices lower than last year by about $100 a ton. That's to the end of February. We don't have the March numbers yet. Buyers have been really active in West Africa, later, really active in Cambodia, later to West Africa now than in previous years. But we are seeing, interestingly, imports from Cambodia, January, February, up by 59%. We'll have the March numbers on the 6th. Cote d'Ivoire, they're not huge volumes, but it's a big increase, more than 400% up in terms of the imports to Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire during January and February. So as I say, that's old crop material coming in, probably sold, but may also be going into warehouses. On the other side, in terms of demand, have a look at exports, and we will have another close look at those when we come to demand. Exports up January to first half March by about 5.5, it's 5.6% is the exact figure. So that, generally speaking, looks positive from a supply perspective from Vietnam, probably in a better situation now than at this time last year. I get the feeling processors are not in any particular hurry to act. They may not need to act, but of course, time moves on. Vietnam is a huge processor and will need to come to market. I think probably there are signs that Vietnamese buyers are already in the market. Don't expect that to push prices though. And what about India, moving from the world's largest processing country to the world's largest consuming country? And India, I think we got to look at India in a way a little bit more conservatively than we normally would. So first of all, if we focus on the imports to India in the early part of the year, we're looking at significant increase during January and a small increase during February on 2 years ago. I'm not going to look too closely at 2025 because it was a little bit different. February was very low last year. But again, significant imports Jan, Feb, that looks interesting. We're got to look at a couple of things here, and this is becoming more and more a focus in India, and you will hear more and more people in India talking about it. The huge dependence on imports. So I think this is becoming a focus for government. We know that cashews were mentioned in the union budget. I believe for the first time, we know this was a significant factor that may well be the kickstart for production initiatives in India. But in the short term, we're looking at a couple of factors that are going to influence the attitude of Indian processors. First of all, currency. The Indian rupee is weakened significantly. India is dependent on oil imports. It's going to affect the currency as a result of the war in the Middle East. 4%, just currency alone has increased RCN prices by 4% in the last month. Now, there was early buying, much more early buying than we'd previously seen. And I think that the last year, that early buying probably meant that the balance at year end was a little bit more positive than previously. Coming to demand in India, long-term, really strong trends, 5 to 7% growth in the market's consumption. I'm using a paid of figures for that. Other people tell me it is actually 6, but it's not a huge variation in this. It's growing somewhere between 5 and 7%. Our own figures would confirm that. So we do a balance sheet for India and it would confirm that. But The impact of energy costs on the economy, the is one side of it. Constrained supply of other tree nuts is another side of it. Ain't so much as that, can you still buy pistachios from Iran? Officially, no, you can't. If you're dependent on oil from, well, oil that comes through the Straits of Hormuz, now we have seen Indian ships being allowed through without interference, but the price of oil, regardless of whether your ships get there or not, the price of oil is much higher. So we have the economic impacts of that. We have the economic impacts of the weaker Indian rupee. So India is 60% at least dependent on RCN imports. If the rupee is weaker, the cost of those imports is rising in Indian rupees. India is not a major re-exporter. That product that India imports stays in India and is consumed by Indian consumers. So when we look at the situation in India, it may well be impacted significantly by the price of energy. It's a little bit less on raw cashew nuts than it would be on other tree nuts. So if you're bringing in finished almonds, for example, from the United States, and the rupee is weaker against the US dollar, that will impact cost directly. On the other hand, if you're bringing in raw cashew nuts and adding value, you're significantly adding value in India. So you would have thought that the impact on cashew nuts would be a little bit less than it might be on other tree nuts. So it could be possible, if this situation continues for any period of time, that what we see is, like we saw in China last year, that the imports of almonds and pistachio nuts falls a little bit. They're in dollars, they're high value, they're finished products, and the import of raw cashew nuts stays steady or even grows because it's impacted less by currency. Now, that's not a trader's point of view. Any trader will say to you, yeah, look, I trade raw cashew nuts, I buy raw cashew nuts, I sell raw cashew nuts. The currency affects what I do. But if you look at the overall economic impact of that, it may be somewhat moderated. Production wise, let's have a look at a couple of things. So I wanted to highlight, we'll come to production in a moment. I just wanted to highlight, first of all, the increase in imports. It's a big increase in imports, Jan-Feb, to over 200%. That's the first thing. Second thing is this decline in the Indian rupee. Now, just looking at that, so this is our chart. This is a short-term chart, March, April, March 1st of April. A loss of 3.8%. That's directly onto cost. Production-wise, current forecast, I hear from various people, including official organizations, between 750 and 775,000 tons. There are some concerns on the weather, and that would be a really good crop for India. I think the record crop is something like 817,000 tons. So relatively speaking, that's a good crop. That was I think it was a 2018 crop. Minor weather concerns in some areas, but India is a vast country. Cashews grow over a vast area of the country. Of course, there are weather concerns. There always will be. Is there a general problem? We don't see it, at least not yet. Longer term, significant ambition arising in India to reduce dependence on imports. That will be difficult. Farmers in India haven't planted more cashews over the years. They haven't seen cashews as economically attractive. They are choosing other crops. But on the other hand, there is plenty of land in India that would be suitable to grow cashew nuts. And of course, plenty of expertise, including high quality varieties that could be planted. Watch this space. You're definitely going to see some activity in increasing production and reducing import dependence. But let's be clear, if demand continues to grow at between 5 and 7%, India is going to be an importer of raw cashew nuts for as long as we can see forward. Will there be a big change in demand? Well, India might change a little bit quicker than other countries in terms of the reaction. If there is a longer term economic impact, of course, there's an economic impact of higher energy prices. The question is not whether there is an impact. The question is how long is it going to last? So if it comes and goes, we may not even notice the impact on demand. If it lasts for months, that'll be a different situation, and we will see an impact on demand in India. Like most of our markets, the United States, China, Germany, India is quite a price sensitive market when it comes to cashews. So let's try and put that together. We've looked at West Africa, we've looked at Southeast Asia, we had a quick look at India. If we can put that together into an estimate of production, and again, we're talking about trends on the 1st of April 2026, generally a later crop. So we're looking at trends rather than exact numbers. It does look to us as if on the pessimistic side, the crop could be down by about 7.7%, but optimistic, and we're talking volume, not quality, it could be as little as 1% down on last year. That's taking all the different estimates country by country and trying to put them together. So even if we take that pessimistic estimate, we're still looking at the largest crop ever, excluding last year. So if people are talking about crop disaster, if they're talking about much smaller crop, it doesn't really add up when you go country by country by country. It does add up to a lot of questions over the situation in Cambodia, questions over the situation in Ivory Coast, and because we're early, some questions over the situation in India. But it does look like there are a lot of alarm bells ringing. And I got to say, mostly in exporters, RCN exporters' offices and traders' offices that may need to be toned down if they're interested in reality. And I said if they're interested in reality because often we're not in the cashew business. Okay, so looking at that, let's have a little look at prices and production. And if you look, so we got this red line. I just thought just out of interest, we'd put the price of 320's FOB. So this will be the cheapest origin FOB. So it's mostly Vietnam. And this tracks prices way back 2008 all the way through to last Friday. And when we look at that, we see a kind of a roller coaster, two big highs in the last decade and relatively steady prices in recent years with that dip back in 2022. What happened in 2022? War happened in 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine with the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. In the second half of the year, demand reacted. And so what we saw then was a dip in demand, which actually probably over impacted on prices, in my opinion. Processors in Vietnam, I think, possibly panicked a little bit. But we certainly saw in the second half of the year a drop in imports into Europe, a drop in imports into the United States. Why is production rising? Why has it risen so strongly over the last decade? Well, the answer is in this big price high in 2017, 2016 into 17, very high prices, and an earlier one going a little bit further back. So when we look at production, production doesn't work year to year. It certainly doesn't work month to month. Production works much more decade to decade. Plant a cashew tree today, you'll see nothing for 3 years. You won't see maturity for 7, and that could be a little more, in some cases a little bit less, but it can easily be a little bit more depending on weather, location, how you look after that tree. So what we're seeing now is the results of higher prices on farms. But it's not just higher prices on farms. So you don't see a situation where price of raw cashew nuts on the farm goes to $1,500 and every farmer goes out and plants. Much longer term, farmers do not tend to cut down trees. So upward price moves, to my mind, may well influence production upward in 5 or 10 years forward. Well, people don't tend to cut down trees, especially smallholders in African countries. They don't tend to cut down trees because the price of cashews wasn't good this year. What they might do is not look after their trees, not plant any new trees, and in extreme cases, and there are some places in India where I understand this is the case last year, just don't bother to collect them. And that's particularly the case if you're using employed workers to go and collect the trees. Should you spend money to go and collect something that's not going to give you a good return? Will we see this trend continue? I think we will. I think we will actually see it accelerate. We've looked at growth rates. Earlier, we spoke about Nigeria, we spoke about Cote d'Ivoire, we spoke about Ghana, we spoke about Guinea-Bissau, we spoke about Cambodia, all showing strong growth rates. All of them between, with the exception of Guinea-Bissau, between 8 and 17% over the last 10 years. Looks to me as if we're set for greater production. How are governments, particularly in Africa, dealing with that? How are they regulating this industry? Well, let's have a look at some of the policy and regulation trends. I'm not going to get too much into the granular detail. More or less, I want to take a broader overview of trends in policy. And we're going to start in Africa. As I said earlier, the most regulated sectors in the world are in Africa. So a few years ago, I did some work for the Pro Cashew project, and we did a series of documents called the Policy Series. That was published in 2023. It's online if you're curious. And during that time, we categorized policy and regulation into three areas. Type 1, low regulation. That's the green countries in Africa. Type 2 was a full interventionist type regulation. And 3 was somewhere in between. What we called it was specialist public sector. So this was distinguished by two things. It was distinguished by one, that there were regulations, but not as strong as in the type 2, or there were regulations, but they simply weren't enforced. So the big trend we note is back in 2022-23, there were 2 red countries, full interventionist. Now there are 5, and there are also more orange countries. So what's happening is that there is more and more intervention, more and more interventionist type models. And this ranges from the highly interventionist end, a ban on raw cashew nut exports, for example, to increases in export taxes and so on. So let's have a look at some of those trends. We might just adjust this a little bit just to take into account some of the time factors. I'm sure. Okay. So policy trends, and we're talking about recent years now. So what we've seen is, first thing, minimum prices. So we've seen farm gate minimum prices lower. Not by much, but they have become lower. We've seen an increased use of the export windows, and probably of more concern, we've seen ad hoc extensions to export windows in the course of the season. We've seen a reduction in support for processors. Support for processors probably reached its height in 2023, and it has been somewhat watered down since then. We've seen increased export taxation on raw cashew nuts, and we've seen certain areas where there's been a lack of action. So lower farm gate prices and reference prices we've seen in Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Ghana this year. But they appear to be based on the raw cashew nut market much more than on the kernels market. I think that's interesting because if you just look at the raw cashew nut market, you get into a situation where you set a price that might be representative of the export of raw cashew nuts, but puts your processors in a difficult position. So you have contradictory impacts of policy. The policy effectively allows farm gate prices to be linked to raw nut export, which is probably a good thing. But at the same time, it makes it more difficult for processors because those prices are too high. No one's ever had a differential for processors and export trade, but the export window is effectively an effort to do that. So you close the market to the export trade, you open it to processors. In theory, less demand, in theory, farm gate prices should be lower, and that should allow processors to get what they want. One of the theories behind the development of processing was that processors would pay farmers higher prices. Hasn't worked out so far. Should do, but it takes time. We've also seen reduced support for farmers, the reduction in the subsidies in Cote d'Ivoire. That was always likely to happen, but it's been a pretty steep decline. Reduction of 62% in the subsidy for foreign-owned companies, less, I think it's 25% for domestic-owned companies, but pretty serious and very sudden reduction without signals, which is quite interesting. On the other side, we have Tanzania, where the access of processors to farmers is ping-ponging between full access and extremely limited access. Some years we've got people talking about, yeah, go and deal with the AMCOs. We know that's a good idea. That will develop processing. That will help farmers. Then the next year you get no processors. You need to go and buy at the auction. What does business like? Business likes stability. Business likes predictability. If you keep even hinting that your policy might change to the detriment of investors, they just won't invest. And this is one of the issues that's happening. So reduced support for processes, you can't switch it on and switch it off in the way that you can switch on and switch off export taxation, in a sense, because with the export of raw cashew nuts, India 60% dependent on imports, Vietnam 90% dependent on imports. Short term, there's not a lot processors can do except effectively reduce the price that ends up with the farmers. So now we're in this transition. We're in the transition from 95% export of raw cashew nuts from African countries to something that will probably end up about 50% in the not too distant future, particularly in Ivory Coast, possibly in Nigeria, possibly in Mozambique as time goes on. So this balance between reducing support for processors and increasing export taxation needs to be carefully managed. And so far, it probably hasn't been carefully managed. It's been managed. And as I know that regulators are conscious of it. Politicians are less conscious of it. That's the nature of politicians. But we are seeing export taxation increase, and that's likely to continue. But sadly, in West Africa, we're seeing less action on some really important areas. We're seeing the promised action on on-farm yields, extension services, development of post-harvest handling, especially infrastructure, largely just hasn't happened. If it has happened, it's been either development organizations or private sector that's done it. But generally speaking, it hasn't, and there's got to be, frankly, alarm bells ringing. Production's growing on average just under 10% per annum. Infrastructure's not growing with it. You have, in some countries, rainy harvest season. Where does that leave us in 10 years? A big surplus of low quality cashew nuts, unless something's done about it. Okay, so policy talking points. I think farm gate prices not being linked to the kernels market, struggles for processors, enforcement of regulation, big talking point. Export windows, big issue around enforcement. There's no point in having a window if some traders, and some of them are big traders, some of them are even multinational traders, are trading in and out of this system. If you don't respect the window, if you don't respect the law, there's not much point in having it. Second aspect, and we saw this in 2024 and the impact it had, we saw it to a lesser extent in 2025. I don't think we're going to see it this year. I hope we're not going to see it this year. But the idea of ad hoc extensions, this has a big impact. You will get a reaction from customers. The customers for raw cashew nuts are processors in India and Vietnam. And I suspect that some of the reluctance, some of the later arrival of processors in Vietnam to the market is due to a reaction to that situation, particularly the 2024 long ad hoc without warning extension. to the processor's window. That was particularly bad news in terms of confidence. Raw cashew nut export bans, that for me is a huge talking point. There are only two countries that do it, but it's something that's been discussed in Nigeria, I think dismissed, and I think that's probably the right thing to do. If you don't have the processing capacity available, why would you ban the export of raw nuts? The only people who suffer from that are the farmers. The only people who benefit are the smugglers. So in some countries, and I think Benin is an example, Benin RCN is fantastic quality, huge demand for that material in India. Banning the export undermines the competitive advantage of that product in the market. Undermining the competitive advantage reduces farm gate prices, eventually runs the risk of reducing production. And it causes smuggling. And if you have smuggling, what you're talking about is effectively a criminalization of the trade. So a farmer sells to a smuggler, that's not a legal transaction. If the farmer knows it's going for smuggling, obviously the smuggling or the network of trade that assembles that product, none of that is legal. And so you end up with an industry that becomes on the margins of legality. And at the same time, you're introducing more and more laws. What sense in this? So this, I think, needs to be really strongly looked at. And then the final one, unrealistic goals. So big goals are good, and we've seen some dramatic achievements in African countries. Production in Tanzania, changes in Mozambique, the growth in Cote d'Ivoire, in processing, the growth in production just about everywhere, more processing in Nigeria. These things are not without their troubles, but they are remarkable achievements if you take the longer term point of view. But unrealistic goals, 100% processing by 2030. These are unrealistic goals, and that undermines investor confidence. It creates opportunity for speculation, and it discourages the existing businesses in the sector. It also has an impact, I feel, on regulators and people who work in government offices because they realize that no matter what they do, they're not going to achieve these kinds of goals. They realize this is not possible in the time frame. So I think it has a problem. There's a lot to be talked about on policy. My job is to point out the anomalies. My job is to discuss the anomalies, but it's politicians, regulators, and their advisors who need to change these things. So let's have a look then. Our final topic for today. We'll have a quick look. I'm not going to go into too much detail on consumption and the cashew kernels trade, but I think it's important that we look at it, particularly with the likely disruption that we're seeing at the moment due to this conflict in the Middle East, and particularly due to the economic impact of that conflict. So cashew kernels. So here's a profile of prices. So we're looking at prices from 2020 until the current year, and we're looking at the high, the low, the year average, and the closing price. First thing we see is that prices have been relatively stable in 2026 and throughout 2025. In fact, since April of 2024, I think April, May of 2024, we saw the first rise, which was justified because prices were too low. And a little bit of a price scare, I believe, was in May when prices hit 360 for 320s. Since then, we've had relative stability. Stability is good for business. We're currently in a range, I would say, somewhere between 315, excluding the lowest price, and 330 for typical kernels. If you're in Africa, high quality certified kernels, you're probably making somewhere between 345 and 355 for most people, but the really top people in Tanzania, for example, are making 370 plus for their 320s, and that's likely to continue. Buyers like them. Market share in Europe is growing. So price stability, not particularly high prices, Although if you came into the industry in 2024 and you looked at today's prices, you might think they were high. But if you think of it over the 5 years, over the longer period, we're about 9% above the average. Short-term drivers, buyers are, I feel, just below the current levels. They were interested to buy. They're a bit concerned now. There is concern on the impact of the war on inflation in Europe, in the United States, in China, the cost of energy in India. These are all major factors that can affect the outlook for demand. If the war ends, probably prices go back fairly quickly. 2022 is quite a good example. We saw energy prices spike up early in the year. Oil and gas moved up to prices similar to those they were at yesterday when I looked. Um, those prices created inflation in Europe, reduced consumption. Second half of the year, we saw a sharp downturn in imports, about 8%, even more so in the United States. But at that time, neither India nor China, as two major markets in Asia, were impacted. That might be different now. You might see some impact in those countries because we're talking about a different dynamic. We're talking about oil from the Middle East. So the outlook, as I see it, is certainly these current level of prices are sustainable. They're sustainable for consumers. We've actually seen price reductions in supermarkets in Europe. They're sustainable for roasters. In the US, for example, we saw the removal of tariffs on cashews in November. That rebalances the book. There is something of a hangover from the tariff period, a lot of disputes, a lot of money to be reclaimed or not reclaimed. Um, but now we're looking at a new situation. So as we went into February, we would have thought this looks like a pretty good year for demand, maybe not as fast growth as last year, but still positive. Now we're looking at a situation where the prospect of inflation, the prospect of economic downturn, the prospect, particularly in Northern Hemisphere countries, as next winter, the winter of 2026 approaches, people will begin to see a tightening of their personal budgets if energy prices remain high. So demand could suffer in China, it could suffer in the United States, it could suffer in India, but India is more complex because you have all kinds of tree nuts, you have cashews as a central part of the food chain, unlike in Europe or the United States, where if we didn't have cashews, we'd regret it, but we would get by. Whereas in India, it's much more part of general consumption. If there is an impact, it's most likely in the second half of the year. Hopefully, we don't see that. Hopefully, we see this war ended long before then, and we see a return to more normal conditions for all reasons, the least of which are the economic reasons, because obviously the human impact is shocking. Can we get any clues from exports early in the year? So I looked at January to mid-March, official figures from Vietnam Customs Authority, and we see an increase of exports by 5.6%. Um, when you look at that chart, what you're looking at there is the total exports of cashew kernels from Vietnam from the 1st of January to the 15th of March for the 4 years in question. 2026 looks good. 2024 is slightly distorted, I think. Um, there were in the early part of 2024, there were very big imports or very big exports to the United States and to China. The two things combined, they leveled out as the year went on. So 5.6% up year on year compared to last year is pretty good performance. I wanted to again just relate this, like I tried to relate production to prices, I wanted to relate this to prices. So here you've got superimposed over the first 2.5 months exports from Vietnam, the cashew kernels prices, and in the highlighted areas in these small boxes, what I'm highlighting is the period September through to February in each of the years. And well, what you can see is relative price stability. Price stability is pretty good for business. Now, in the first 2 years, prices were low. Prices were in the 250, probably 243 to 263 range in that period and relatively stable. Then during 2024, we saw the big step up and we saw, again, relative price stability in the periods in question, just at higher levels. 2025, prices up here, pretty much where they are now in this sort of 320, 350 range. And this year, 315 to 330 range, generally speaking. A couple of things I'd say on that. First of all, it's interesting to note that it would appear that the higher prices have not impacted demand at all. In fact, demand has improved over the period. So whereas low prices were not particularly impactful in 2023, maybe in 2024, but thereafter, we haven't really seen any impact of higher prices. And that was one of the big questions that we were asking as we came into 2025. This time last year and earlier, we were wondering, will these higher prices have an impact on demand? The answer is not by the looks of it so far. Much more impactful have been politics, tariffs, sadly now again, the war in the Middle East. Let's have a look at these numbers for this period, January, February, country by country. So I look at 5 regions. I take China as a region because it's so dynamic. US and Canada, that's mainly the US, of course. Top 10 countries in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, the top 6 importers, and Eastern Central Asia. So this would be all countries of Asia, excluding China. So this would be countries like Japan, Korea. It would also actually include Australia, New Zealand, countries, strictly speaking, in Oceania. If you look at it, what we're seeing is that compared to last year, trade with China is up. Trade with the US and Canada is well up. Interestingly, what we're seeing is trade to the United States back to much more normal levels in the first 2 months of the year. Now, that may not continue, but it is a positive sign. We see Europe there or thereabouts, similar to last year. A little bit of an increase in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, obviously, once we get the March figures, that's going to change because of the conflict, and then quite strong growth from relatively modest levels, but quite strong growth in Eastern Central Asia. So if you stood right now, you'd say it's been a steady start to the year. Okay, I'm getting some interference. I'm getting French interpretation over the sound. That might be a technical impact. Not a problem. Thanks very much. Okay, so what we're saying is we've seen a steady start to the year. Uh, Quite impressive. North America, effectively the United States, exports from Vietnam up by 23%. Is that a return to normal trends? Yeah, it could well have been. Bear in mind, tariffs were removed back in November. Is it a catch up? Is it a return to normal trend? Yeah, but, and of course, it's the big question, how will demand perform in the current situation? That's demand. Integral part of demand and a very important trend is processing in Africa. And I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges that African processors are facing. In the big picture, processing in Africa has been growing quickly. It's been growing at 23% per annum since 2021. It's hugely located in Ivory Coast. 71% of African cashew processing is in Côte d'Ivoire. Therefore, that development is not level. Therefore, the changes in subsidies, the farm gate prices, these are all going to have impacts on the overall processed volume. The market share, so West African countries where most of the development has been, although we're seeing a pickup again in East Africa now, generally those countries focus on Europe and they focus on the United States. At least that was the original thought. Market share in Europe has increased 22% last year. 22% of imports of cashew kernels to the European Union came from African countries. United States, it's stable. It's between 6 and 7% in recent years. Last year, it was slightly down on the previous year. What's more concerned, I think, is that most African countries actually experienced a reduction in their cashew kernels exports to Europe and the United States last year. Cote d'Ivoire took a larger share, Nigeria took a larger share, but many other countries saw a reduction. So we are looking at some challenges for processors in African countries. Farm gate prices, even though they're lower, are still high compared to the kernels market. That's a competitive issue. The raw material quality is lower this year. That means cost of processing will rise. That means that African processors will need some support from their customers in order to keep going this year. Changes and reduced support for processors, reduction in subsidies, the introduction of taxes on the export of Burma kernels. So many processors have become dependent on the export of partially processed, unpeeled cashew kernels to Vietnam. I don't think it's a good idea to be dependent, but if you can't do it or if it's more costly to do it, it does have an impact on your business. And of course, that is going to be a key factor when Vietnamese authorities are telling us they imported more than 100,000 tons of Burma kernels. That'll be mainly from African countries in 2025. On the other hand, you're going to have a later and a longer crop, so that might reduce the shock of the early season cash flow of the higher prices. So it's really a challenging time for African processing. It's come from a period of strong development, strong growth in capacity, strong growth in processing, but very much centered on Ivory Coast. And this is not going to be an easy year for African processors, particularly in those countries where the quality of the raw material is less than it would normally be hoped for. Still on the subject of demand, we'll have a look at the volatility of demand. We'll have a quick look at some of the factors that are impacting demand. I'll come back to that in a moment. The I wanted to just touch on the outlook for the year before we go there. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit was these overall trends. And then we'll go back in and we'll have a look at volatility. So the first factor I think we need to consider is that higher costs. So higher costs are supporting, they're not supporting pieces, they're supporting prices. So higher costs will support prices. They'll stop prices falling simply because the job cannot be done any cheaper this year due to higher energy costs. I don't think that the level of production, it's probably going to be a decent volume crop, quality lower, but I don't think there's anything in production that will cause prices to be lower. I think unlikely to cause prices to be much higher either, because it will be a reasonably good crop. So I think we've got these balancing factors. We've got higher costs, lower quality, increasing costs of processing. It is a formula for price stability. But if we get an impact on demand, that would change. And that would change in the second half of the year to make processors' life even more complex. I think India and China might be most affected by the energy prices this year. I think that that might be just different nature. We in Europe and the US, we had Russia invading Ukraine, we had higher gas prices, we'd rampant inflation, we'd a downturn in demand. We could get that again. But I think in this case, perhaps the higher oil prices based on oil from the Middle East is more likely to impact demand in China and India. I hope not, but it is a risk. I think buyers would, and probably rightly, I'm talking kernels buyers now, buyers will take their time. The prices work, but I think they will take their time until they see how things are going. I think RCN is still out of line. Now, whether that's just simply speculative plays from the trade, or whether it's something that will change now that countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina start to open their export seasons. Um, but definitely right now, raw cash nut prices are too high compared to kernels, and to a certain extent, too high compared to farm gate prices too. And finally, in terms of the outlook, I think that probably the fear that we had that governments, regulators might intervene in the market, that's receding as the weeks advance. And there's no real reason, to my mind, why they should be active in the market. Bearing those things in mind, bearing this overall outlook, and we're talking about reasonable production, lower quality, we're talking about threats to demand at a time of workable prices for most stakeholders. Let's just go back to that volatility factors and just have a look at some of the factors that have influenced the market over the years. If we look at periods of fast growth, so what you've got on this chart is annual growth in consumption. So consumption is defined by imports for most countries, but for India, actual consumption. And we see the level of growth. So we saw, going back to 2013, extremely fast growth, 2019, and then in other years like 2022 or 2020, we see slow growth. So that's what those bars mean. And the percentages are the increase in growth compared to the previous year. So when do we see the fastest growth? We see the fastest growth during periods of price stability. 2012 through to 2014 into 2015, fast growth. Then we saw price volatility, record high prices. In fact, growth virtually disappeared. It reappeared very quickly, but was impacted by three crises: COVID-19, Russia's attack on Ukraine and the extension to the full war there, and tariffs and politics over the last 18 months or so. And in those crises, we saw much slower growth. So when we look at the reaction of consumption, and we look at it in two ways. We look at it, first of all, to crises. So delays in shipments or perceived delays in shipments, and we see that it reacts very quickly. So COVID comes, demand growth disappears. High energy prices, war in Ukraine appears, growth collapses. Tariffs and politics, we saw, not globally, but we saw imports to the United States crash, and to a certain extent, we saw the impact of that in 2025. So the market reacts quickly to crises, but it recovers quickly too. 2021, big spike in demand. 2019, 2023, 2024, fast growth in demand after the crisis passes, or at least after it's better understood. On the other hand, when we look at the periods of price volatility, you see a much slower return of demand. It does return to growth, and there are only a handful, I think it's only 3 years of the last 30 where we have seen negative numbers when we calculate growth globally. So the market reacts a little bit more slowly, and that's partially because people have forward cover. It's partially because sometimes, changing demand is like turning a ship. It takes time. It takes sometimes a long time, sometimes up to 18 months. So when we see high prices and price volatility, we see slower reaction, but a much slower recovery too. My point is, what we're looking at now is price stability combined with the crisis. If the crisis passes quickly, we would expect to see a very fast return to normal demand pattern. The longer the crisis lasts, the greater the impact. So when it passes, we will see a fast return to demand. I think that's almost certain. When that will be, well, I'm not the person to ask that question of, but we will know, I think, over the coming weeks. So this needs to be watched very quickly. I don't believe certainly seeing an impact on decision making, but we're not yet seeing an impact on shipments that will come later, and it may not come at all if the situation resolves in the coming weeks, which let's hope that that will happen. So a relatively neutral outlook as we look at things at the moment. We're talking about one threat, one rumor, one talk about a disastrous crop is passing, but there's another one on the horizon, and that's a threat to demand. How quickly that's solved will give us a better idea. But the underlying trends in demand, generally speaking, in all markets, underlying trends are relatively strong. Assuming economies are healthy, Indian consumers, Europeans, Americans, Chinese consumers, and elsewhere will buy more cashews year on year. Whether they'll buy more quickly enough to meet this fast growing in production, well, that's another matter. And on current figures, the answer to that would be it won't grow quickly enough to meet the increases in production. Time will tell. We'll talk about it again in 2 weeks and we'll focus on some other subjects. But for now, let me pass you back to Isaac and see, Isaac, are there any questions or comments on some of these subjects we've been discussing?
Yes, Jim, thank you for your presentation. There are a few questions and comments. The first one is from Abdul. Abdul is asking what measures are being put in place to ensure proper data collection mechanism, which should help in better identifying trends and accurate prediction, and also for better planning.
Okay, Isaac, I lost you there for a moment, but I'm reading a question. What are we doing to ensure proper, robust data gathering in most countries, especially in Nigeria? Is that the one you're asking me?
Yes, that's the question I'm asking.
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, I think what we're seeing is it's a good question, and it's a question that should be asked more and more, and it's a question I've been asking for years. Um, we do see ACA doing more training of data gatherers. So the ACA has a group of collectors of data who are already engaged in the business and understand it. And we have been doing some training, and we will restart that training in April to ensure better data. The ACA has also introduced what they call the cashew barometer, which is a subscription service with a series of data charts. Some of the data pretty good. It's developing, it's improving. We have this webinar, which is based on collected data. The way I might talk about it sounds a lot like opinion, but it's all based on collected data behind it. If you ask specifically about Nigeria, what I would like to see in Nigeria, and indeed other countries, is a better collection of data on production. It would be really good to see a really good detailed survey. Where are the trees? What are the yields? Who are the farmers? How do they make an income from cashews if they do? And that would be a really good thing. And if that were to be repeated right across the world, it would start to cast some light on how this business works. And we still, largely, let's be very clear about it, to a certain extent, we still operate on the margins of science when it comes to cashew data. ACA is trying to change that. Great question. Thank you for that. Isaac, have we got another
Okay.
one?
Yes, we have a few more. This is a comment from Aswani. He says last year was highest crop. However, there is hardly any brought forward stocks. Many factories in India seems to be closed due to raw material availability. If that is the case, if we say we have lower crop this year, we should expect quite a bit of shortage. if the demand of kernel is maintained. Any reaction to this?
Yeah, last year was the highest crop. No, I don't agree that there wasn't any forward stocks. There were forward stocks in Africa. We've seen imports, like I mentioned, into Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire. Had to be old crop. We know there are some stocks of old crop in Vietnam. I think that the carry out was in Africa probably more than normal. In India, demand was robust, so maybe in India the stock is less. I think that factories in India close when they're not making money. I think they're right to do that, but I don't think that that's necessarily a judge that there's shortage in the market. I don't anticipate any shortage in the market at all, even if kernel demand is maintained, but it's unlikely that kernel demand will be maintained because what may have been lost in the Middle East, for example, in the last few weeks, that's not coming back. It's not that people consume their cashews once it's gone, it's gone. So once a festival period is gone, for example, they don't catch up. It's not like some of the products. I think there was enough stock, and I think we probably entered the year with not with surplus on paper, but with surplus far from where it was needed. So the additional stock might have been in India at the end of 2024, but at the end of 25, it was probably in Vietnam or it was in West Africa. Good point, though. Thank you for that one. Isaac, what else have we
Yes.
got?
There are more. Rohit is asking on Vietnam processes. He says big processors are currently they are mainly focusing on buying RCN from Cambodia and Vietnam since there are good prices and fast delivery. But this will not be enough. And as West Africa RCN price are still far than break even compared to kernel prices. So what should be the strategy for big processors in Vietnam to collect their RCN stock throughout the year?
Interesting one. Good question, Rohit. Good observations. Thank you for those. If you saw 2 weeks ago, we talked about the this balance between kernels prices and RCN prices, and we too came to the conclusion that RCN prices were too high compared to the kernels market, and I think that's still the case. So two options in this case: put up the price of kernels. That's going to be tough in the current environment. It's unlikely to work. Or raw cashew nut prices come down. I think at all costs, processors need to avoid any kind of potential speculative bubble. They need to avoid situations where there might be any opportunity to squeeze the market arising. So buy steadily. You can't, I mean, obviously buy what's economically viable, but you can't allow shortages to materialize simply because if you do, the cost of the whole crop goes up. So I think buyers have to buy carefully and steadily. And this is where the question of infrastructure and warehousing in West Africa that we mentioned comes into play. So we get this issue that on one hand, it'll be a slower market, but on the other hand, where do we store this product? And that's to this year, it will be managed. 5 years from now, it won't be managed because that trade will be so much bigger. Interesting point. If I were a
Okay.
buyer of raw cashew nuts, I'd be buying as little as I can in as long a period as I can to keep my factory running. I would make some allowance for the fact that there might be some disruption to shipping. I wouldn't panic. Um, and I would be telling my kernels customers, look, this is the reality. Here's the numbers. Can you help us out here a little bit?
All right.
Isaac,
Yes. So the next question, you mentioned that the quality of cashew isn't great, hence becomes an issue selling in the global markets. Are producers in Africa adapting to the use of AI and deep learning to have an impact? If so, how are these new technologies affecting or really impacting their activities?
no, they're not using those technologies. I didn't. I said quality isn't great. I didn't actually say that. What I said was it's not as good as last year. Um, it doesn't really affect the kernels in the end. it affects the processing economics. From a point of view of farmers, the technology can help them to judge the weather, but if you want, we're talking about smallholder farmers, farmers generally speaking of less than 2 hectares. We're talking about subsistence agriculture. The application and the use of technology has to come from somewhere else. It has to come from governments, it has to come from development organizations to assist in perhaps forecasting weather, informing farmers what to do at the right time to do it, how to act in certain weather conditions, what those weather conditions might be. And I think that the um, impact of the technologies could be significant, but are they being used? No, I don't see them being used at the moment. Um, we're talking about people who struggle with basic agricultural practices and improving them. West Africa is the lowest yields in the world on cashew farms, but produces the most cashews in the world. So the application of technology is complex and it's not an easy answer. We might be able to demonstrate the benefits of certain applications, but the implementation, distribution, education around them is going to be really challenging. It's a really interesting subject going forward. What else, Isaac?
And a question on the impact of the war. Considering the fact that most of India's exports go to the Middle East, will the war cause exporters to try and push kernels into the local markets? And how is that likely to impact prices?
Good question. So the Middle Eastern market is constrained in recent weeks and likely to be constrained in coming weeks. Certainly buyers are not going to make a lot of decisions. So yeah, so in that region, Middle East, Central Asia, countries that are, let's say, within that spectrum of influence, it's about 9% of world demand. About half of that is supplied from India. So Vietnam has made significant inroads into those regions in recent years, very successfully. But India remains the go-to for many buyers, particularly in UAE, and other countries in the region. Well, there's a couple of choices, isn't there, for processors? They can continue to process and try and sell in the domestic market. India exports about 10% of its production. Would it be difficult for the domestic market to absorb that? Probably not. But there is another option, and that is to process less for export, in which case the demand for raw cashew nuts would decline a little bit. Either way, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on prices, quite frankly, not compared to the potential impact of the economic consequences of higher energy prices and the overall impact of the war. Isaac,
Okay, so this questioner says he observed an interesting transaction last year. A Chinese company purchased around 1,000 tons of raw cashew nuts from one of their partners and shipped them to a factory in China for processing and grading. Do you see this model becoming more common in the near future, with Chinese companies increasingly sourcing raw cashew nuts directly and handling processing domestically?
that's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, I had a look at the statistics for the imports of raw cashew nuts into China. They haven't changed hugely in recent years. There is certainly one, maybe two processing facilities in China, um, but it would be a very limited business. Now, at the World Cashew Conference back at the end of January, the representative of the CNFA, the Chinese chamber, told us that they were quite happy with their existing suppliers and that it was unlikely that China would engage in major cashew processing. I think what's more likely is that Chinese investors would build factories in African countries to supply kernels. We've seen that in as an ongoing project in Tanzania. We've seen it in Ghana. Now, sometimes those factories are built not as direct investments in cashews, but as part of other activities, as part of maybe promises to government, maybe situations where the the Chinese investor has a commitment in a product like sugar or in energy or in infrastructure, and the government says, look, as part of your investment strategy, as part of your obligation in your investment incentives, why not invest in agricultural processing? And they might build a factory. So no, I don't believe that you will see large volumes go from directly from African countries to China for processing. I think Vietnam will continue to dominate in that area. And secondly, I think it is likely that we will see increased investment by Chinese companies in processing in Africa. And also, to remind you, we mentioned it last day, but the tariffs, I think it's from 53 African countries, the tariffs on the import of a whole range of products, including cashew nuts, to China have been dropped. I think they're ending 1st of May, which will also be interesting. But it's an interesting one and it could happen. But my view is it's not going to happen. You're not going to see large scale processing in China for now, at least. What else have we got, Isaac?
There is another one here on local processes. It said, in spite of prime procurement window, zero export taxes, no container freight to be paid, the African processor looks to be not very happy and mostly wants lower farm gate prices. Does this indicate a sectorial inefficiency?
Okay, I've never met a happy cashew processor in Africa or anywhere. They've always got something to complain about. So it's a tough business. Does it indicate a sectoral inefficiency? Yeah, the cost of processing remains too high in African countries. The access to finance remains difficult. Is that surprising in an industry that at this scale is less than a decade old? It's not at all surprising. Is it changing? Yeah, it is changing. So I think that African processors have reason to be a little bit unhappy because of the farm gate prices, the regulation, the reduction in supports. But on the other hand, processing in Africa continues to grow. So being unhappy and investing is a kind of a contradiction, but it seems to continue. I think that the successful, well-run African cashew factories have a bright future, and I think some of them are already doing really well. I think you will see that move forward in the next 2 or 3 years. There will be disruptions, but it will happen. I think also that we need to bear in mind that building an industry takes time, making it efficient takes time. Replacing a culture in business that's based on speculation takes time. As those things change, we will see more efficient factories. For me, there are a couple of things that are very difficult to change. The cost of energy, for example, is very difficult to change. It's going to be higher in African countries, but it's well balanced by location closer to market, location closer to supply chain. So those things will balance out these cost factors. On the other hand, if we look at the aspects where African cashew processing is strong in terms of its carbon footprint, in terms of its sustainability profile, in terms of traceability and storytelling, it can be very strong. But those are aspects which still need to be properly focused and exploited. So yeah, they're complaining, but I don't think they're complaining as much as they were complaining 5 years ago. Maybe we just leave it at that for the moment. But it is an interesting point. And I think one thing that's very interesting to look at is to look at the cost of processing in African cashew factories. And as we see that changing, I'm lucky enough to work with some of them and to see how those costs are coming into line. And that makes me more optimistic. Really interesting question. I think
Right.
we could talk about that one all day.
Yes. Zachariah Isaku sends quite a long one, but interesting. So I'm going to read it. He says delays in opening export markets in West Africa, often intended to for domestic processing, rarely translate into improved incomes for producers once export restrictions are lifted. In practice, aggregators tend to dominate the market during this transition period, purchasing and stockpiling large volumes in anticipation of export opportunities. Intermediaries capture most of the price gains, while farmers see little to benefit. This approach therefore fails to achieve its intended objective of
Mm.
supporting producers and strengthening local value addition. Instead, it creates market distortions, weakens price transmission of farmers, and reinforces the position of intermediaries. A more effective strategy would require structured procurement systems, transparent pricing mechanisms, and stronger farmer organizations to ensure that value is equitably distributed across the value chain. Interesting, Jim.
Yeah, I don't think there's much that Zachariah says that's wrong. I think like, okay, a couple of things that probably are interesting to focus on. So on the one hand, we're talking about export windows, which limits the market for producers and in theory should limit the prices. But if that's combined with good setting of minimum farm gate prices, and if that's enforced, then the lack of competitiveness in the supply chain should be offset by a reasonable farm gate price. If that farm gate price isn't enforced, or if it's unenforceable, then we have a problem. At least it's a problem for producers. Now, many people would also say, and I'm going to let's say, devil's advocate, the other side of the coin. If you look at it and say, well, if farmers aren't happy, why are they planting so many cashew trees? Why is production rising so quickly if it doesn't make sense for farmers? And that the answer to that is more complex and it probably lies in the nature of smallholder chains, the fact that cashews are not grown by commercial farmers and that probably even small farmers have less commercial motivation than small farmers in other sectors, possibly if we were to compare it to cocoa. I agree. I wouldn't describe it as structured procurement systems. And I certainly wouldn't see the state as having a role in that. But what I would think is would be really effective, and I think maybe you and I, Zachariah, are on the same trajectory on this one. If we saw integrated supply chains, one of the expectations of the development of processing was that processors would be able to interact directly with farmers. That infers farmer organization because you can't directly interact with individual farmers. You have to have some form of organization. So if you've got processors want to buy from farmers, farmers organize, that encourages transparency, it encourages year-round relationships, it encourages other business on other products, maybe on the distribution of inputs, maybe on the distribution of expertise. That would make a really strong system. There's evidence that it works. When we look at some of the more advanced processors in West Africa, we see that those who have developed integrated supply chains have been successful. One of the problems now emerging is that if we get into a situation of surplus production or fast growing production, we can get into a situation which actually enforces the current situation, creates speculation, enforces opportunistic sourcing mechanisms, meaning that the opportunity for farmers to profit from their labor is reduced, and meaning that prices at the farm gate probably come under pressure. And that's a real threat. This is not new. This was known 10 years ago, 15 years ago. What wasn't known 10 or 15 years ago was that it would get this big in terms of the size and scale of the structure. That's an ongoing discussion. I'd love to, maybe in one of our webinars, we'd start to talk about integration of supply chains and the impact of that. Maybe we'll get some experts to join us for that discussion. Great point, Zachariah. Many thanks for that. Isaac, anything else?
All right, Jim. So we have a few more questions. One from Aswani again. It says, do we expect to see a push for local processing in Cambodia, like we currently seeing in Cote d'Ivoire and other African countries? And how would this affect the supply to Vietnam?
Personally, yes, I do expect to see local processing develop in Cambodia. I think there are attractive investment opportunities there. On the one hand, I think on the other hand, it's challenging. So there's two aspects to it. Most Cambodian cashews are exported without being dried. There's very little post-harvest structure in place that's necessary in order to develop integrated supply chains. Secondly, most of the Cambodian cashew nuts are the very large nuts. They're 80% of the famous M23 variety. That creates different models. I think there will be an evolution of processing in Cambodia. I don't think it will be as quickly as Ivory Coast has done it, and I don't think it will really affect the supply to Vietnam for many years to come. And I wouldn't rule out that Vietnamese processors invest either in post-harvest assembly businesses in Cambodia or directly in processing in Cambodia in the future. This is one that's playing out right now. Short answer is yeah, there will be local processing. There will be more local processing in Cambodia in the years to come. Isaac,
Finally, a question from Isaac. I see most West African countries remaining with unsold stocks. Example, Nigeria having sold only 50% of its produce, only 500,000 metric tons processed internally in Cote d'Ivoire, and for sure little exports of kernels by Vietnamese. What will this mean to the countries that will come into the market in the second half of 2026?
okay, let's step back from this question. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. Let's step back from one thing and let's say that so far exports of kernels from Vietnam are quite healthy. January, 15 March, up by 5.6% from the all-time record last year. So far exports are not bad at all. I agree, and I have been discussing there is a risk to that. I don't think that the situation in West Africa is any different to any other year. I don't think that if Nigeria has only sold 50% of its production, earlier we talked about a number of 150,000 tons. Yeah, that's in or around 50%. Some will be processed within the country too. Yes, there's some selling to be done there. Cote d'Ivoire, the window for export has only just opened. So, strictly speaking, you couldn't be doing export trade up to now anyway. Similarly for Burkina Faso. Similarly for Guinea-Bissau, because the crop isn't in yet. So, if we look at this, countries which have been open have made some sales. Nigeria sold half of its stock. I don't particularly see that there's a worse situation than in any other year. Now, that might change, and that's been the point of our discussion this morning, is to say that demand has been good, but there is a threat to demand. If demand was to turn down sharply, what would happen in the second half of the year? Let's go back to 2022. What we saw in 2022 was a situation where demand in Western countries was impacted. That had virtually no impact on countries entering the market with RCN later in the year, Tanzania, Mozambique, Indonesia, Brazil, but mainly we're focused East Africa because that's where the volume is. That product at that time went to the market fairly smoothly. If there was an impact on demand in India, then Tanzania might have a problem. Mozambique might have a problem. And that's something that will only see in time. So as things stand, what we're watching for is to see the impact of inflation and energy prices on cashew demand and how long that continues. If it's 4, 8, 10 weeks, I don't see any major problem. If we're still looking at this disruption, high inflation, high energy prices in June and July, then I think there is a good chance that prices would fall in the second half of the year. My own opinion is that's unlikely. My own opinion is that this will get resolved sooner rather than later. And let's hope it does. Nice question, Isaac.
All right.
Um,
So the next session is on the 15th of April in 2 weeks. What should we expect?
well, we're going to talk about markets again. Now, I'm not going to say what the focus. So today we had markets and policy and production. In 2 weeks, I'm going to leave that open because it may be, depending on the political developments, that we want to focus on demand closely. It may be that we want to have a look at production. We're going to look at markets. We're going to look at production. We're going to look at demand. It's going to be very interesting 2 weeks. There are, in some countries, there's a big holiday weekend coming up, Easter weekend. It's a big holiday in Europe. It's also in North America, many other places. So that'll quieten down business. And then we'll see, within 2 weeks, we'll see how the impact of the opening of the export season in Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina and other African countries impacts the market. So it's, as always, it's going to be some interesting times in cashews. Thanks very much, Isaac. Thanks very much, everyone. It's always a pleasure to talk cashews. And some of those questions today, they were really good and challenging. And thanks so much for those. But for now, take care. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks to everyone at ACA.
All right. Thank you, Jim, for today's presentation. Before we go, I would like to remind everyone that online registration for the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo in Accra, Ghana in September is open. Register now and enjoy up to 40% discount on all conference rates. We'd also acknowledge the support of our partners and sponsors, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, the GIZ Move Cashew Projects, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Thank you very much for participating in today's session. See you in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.